So I'm reading Adyashanti's Resurrecting Jesus. Chapter 10, Miracles and Transfiguration. I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. John 8:12. Anyone familiar with the Jesus story can't help but be fascinated by Jesus, the miracle worker. To me, whether the miracles described in the Gospels really happened or not isn't ultimately an important question. A miracle is simply something we can't explain with rational thought processes or scientific analysis. From that perspective, miracles are very real. Even awakening itself, when it occurs, seems like a miracle. When we see with the eyes of divine presence, there are miracles everywhere. Miracles all around us. The more conscious we become, the more powerful we become. We don't necessarily become miracle workers, but we begin to awaken to our state of conscious. But as we begin to awaken to our state of consciousness opens. Different capacities within us come online and are available to us. As you come into harmony in life, then mysteriously, almost miraculously, life seems to come into harmony with you. There is a sense that everything is unfolding just as it needs to, that everything is right on time. As we let go of trying to control life, trying to force it in the direction that the ego wants it to go, life has a way of literally responding to our state of consciousness. And that's a miracle. That as your state of consciousness transforms, life's relationship with you transforms as well. For some people, that may seem like an outlandish idea, but it's just part and parcel of becoming more conscious. We cannot actually separate ourselves from life. All lines of separation are illusory. You can't remove a human body from its environment. Without the oxygen you breathe, you will die. Without the warmth of the sun, you can't survive. The more conscious we become of the interconnectedness of all of life, the more life itself starts to work with us in a harmonious way. That's a miracle. How a human being can produce a baby, bring a beautiful little being into life, that's a miracle. When we focus only on the big, extravagant miracles, we become unconscious to the fact that life itself is a miracle. The mere fact that there's anything rather than nothing is an absolute miracle. Miracles are all around us. We just have to open our eyes and see. The more we open to the reality of our own divinity, the more we start to perceive life as a miraculous event. And though the miracles of our everyday lives may pass unnoticed by the self-obsessed mind, they are there nonetheless. It seems to me that a very intimate aspect of awakening is becoming aware of the daily miracle we move through, the miracle called life. Then the big miracles of the kind we find Jesus undertaking can draw our attention to the miracle of our own lives. I see the miracles depicted in the New Testament as being representative of deeper underlying realities. In other words, the miracles are themselves metaphors or teaching tools to hone our awareness. So we begin to become conscious of things in life and in ourselves that we usually aren't conscious of. All of the miracles in the Jesus story have what I'd call an ulterior motive. The point of the miracle isn't the miracle, but the underlying teaching that the miracle conveys. Jesus calms the storm. The first miracle I want to discuss takes place when Jesus is crossing the Sea of Galilee by boat. Here's how the story reads. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat, so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you not have faith? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." Mark 4:37 through 41, NIV. There's an obvious miracle here when Jesus rebukes the wind and the waves. I love this rebuke, this quiet, be still. This is the most potent spiritual practice, just to be quiet, to be still. When someone of spiritual maturity, like Jesus, says, "Quiet, be still," then things will be quiet and still. Picture them together in a boat in the midst of a furious storm. The disciples, fearing for their lives, worried that the boat might overturn, while Jesus is lying in the stern of the boat asleep on a cushion. This image shows with great clarity the difference between these two orders of being. Jesus is grounded in divine being, in that place from which everything is always perfectly okay. That center does not know fear. It does not know anxiety. That's the place where Jesus dwells. The disciples, on the other hand, move from the place of the ego. They are afraid for their lives, and their base instinct is simply to survive. They are as unstable as the wind when they are overtaken by fear. Now, the fact that they're on water is also fascinating. Earlier, I mentioned that water is the medium of the ethical and moral dimension, and in spiritual stories, it's also the medium of purification. In modern psychological terms, water indicates the unconscious. So here is Jesus with his disciples floating in a boat on the water, which represents the ethical and moral domain that most religions occupy. Sorry about that. In its wildness and turmoil, it also represents the unconscious. This is a wonderful mythic image. I think everyone has experienced inner states full of anxiety, of turmoil, of emotions and fears that threaten to overwhelm them. In those moments, you struggle for equilibrium, trying to hold on to something that can give you peace. But your own psychology is quite out of your control. You can't command it to calm down unless you're of a different order of being. Jesus is completely at ease, floating upon the waters of the deep unconscious, which are filled with all those forces within ourselves that we usually try to hide from and to deny. Why is Jesus at peace in this realm? Because he's awakened being, and because he's dealt with all this before. He faced these forces in the desert when he faced Satan, his demon, his own unconscious shadow. Jesus has been through all of this. He's found the center, and he knows what's ultimately most important to him. He's not fractured in his psychology or in his intentions. He is completely and absolutely unified, established at the still point of eternity within his own being. And thus he knows the unconscious is no threat to him, no matter how dark the shadows, no matter how threatening or malicious they seem to be. The disciples are still caught in the world that swirls around the still point of eternity. I'll read that again. The disciples are still caught in the world that swirls around the still point of eternity. They're in the relative world and they're powerless. Jesus, however, has found the peace beyond all understanding. He can say to those waves of the unconscious, "Be still," and instantly they will be still. The disciples could scream, "Be still," and it would have no effect. It's similar to what can occur when you sit in meditation. Anyone who's sat in stillness knows what it's like when you're trying to be calm and at peace, but the mind and emotions are in turmoil, and there doesn't seem to be anything you can really do about it. You can't control it. All you know is that you want it to stop. So you hold on to whatever meditative techniques you have in the hopes that it will help. Anyone who's meditated has had this sort of experience at some point or another, probably many, many times. But someone who has real dominion over the shadowy realm of the unconscious is not afraid of it. They know it. They've dealt with it. And when they say, Be still. There's perfect stillness. It's not a technique. It comes from a deeper state of consciousness. As this story shows, Jesus belongs to the dimension of divine being, while his disciples belong to the dimension of egoic consciousness. Thus, Jesus has a hard time understanding his disciples. To him, it's all so simple. Why don't you just have faith? In his dimension, it's no big deal. But to the disciples, it's a big deal, to the point that Jesus stilling the wind and waves is more frightening to them than the storm itself. In terror, they ask each other, who is this? Who is this person who we're following? What they're asking is, what have I gotten myself into? I think many people who have deeply engaged in their spiritual journey have had moments where they wonder, wow, what did I get involved in? What have I done? At the beginning of the journey, it feels like you are chasing God, and that's something you can comprehend. But at some point, if you chase God long enough and sincerely enough, everything switches, and it feels like God is chasing you. And once God is chasing you, you realize the reins of your life are really no longer in your ego's hands. Some other force is now commanding your spiritual journey, and your life has given way to a new, transforming force, the force of spirit and fire. And spirit and fire, as we've said, are not predictable, cannot control them. Once they've been released within you, they have a life of their own that is unpredictable. Again, this whole story can be seen as a metaphor for something common to all human beings. When we read this only as a story about Jesus and the disciples, then we hold ourselves at a distance from it. But when we open to its deeper meaning, we see ourselves reflected back. Then we must ask ourselves, do I align myself with the energy field Jesus represents, that quiet, still place in the midst of turmoil? Or do I get caught up in the waves of the unconscious with all their fears and anxieties? The Transfiguration. The story I want to look at next is not a miracle in the sense of what Jesus does, but rather in the sense of what happens to him. This is a story of transfiguration. I think that by any definition, the Transfiguration is a miracle story, and what occurs is of enormous consequence and has enormous power, as we'll see. First, let's read the story in its entirety as it appears in Matthew, as I think it's quite beautifully written. After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up a mountain by themselves. There he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. Just then there appeared before them Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, a bright cloud covered them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my son whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell face down to the ground, terrified. But Jesus came and touched them. "Get up," he said. "Don't be afraid." When they looked up, they saw no one but Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus instructed them, "Don't tell anyone what you have seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." Matthew 17, 1-9, NIV. What actually occurs up on this mountain when Jesus becomes transfigured? What happens to Jesus when his face shone like the sun and his clothes became as white as the light? The transfiguration is a part of spiritual unfolding that arrives at a particular point in the journey of awakening. It comes well after the initial awakening. After you've gone through trials, often years of trials, and met those trials from the state of divine being. These experiences have helped you come to a totally unified state, a state of abiding peace, of abiding tranquility. At that point, you may think, well, that's all there is to it. I've arrived at this beautiful place of freedom, but there's still something else to come. What the Gospels call the Transfiguration, a new and unexpected influx of spiritual energy. It's very hard to describe exactly what happens in Transfiguration. It's as if you fully become the radiance of divine being. You have to go to a deeper level than was required either for your initial awakening or for the trials and tribulations that followed. In a sense, you become a fully spiritualized being. This doesn't mean you no longer have a human component. There's still a human being there, every bit as much as there was in the Jesus story. But there is a shift. For certain people, it's radical, as this story depicts. But for others, it's subtler. For Jesus, the transfiguration orients him completely toward his destiny, toward the fate of his life. Prior to the transfiguration, Jesus obviously has access to the divine radiance in a deep and profound way. He utilized it in his healings and pointed toward it in his parables. But it is during the transfiguration that he fully becomes the radiance. He has become fully spiritualized right down to his physicality. He fully embodies divine being. The voice of God confirms, "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased." It's interesting that Moses and Elijah were also on the mountain at the moment of his transfiguration, not as physical beings, but as visionary witnesses to his spiritual unfolding. I had a similar experience on the very day of one of my profoundest awakenings in my early 30s. I just wanted to be by myself on that day, so I went for a walk up on the top of a hill, St. Joseph's Hill, above an old Catholic seminary building that had long since closed down. I'm not usually a visionary kind of person, but as I stood on that hilltop, I had a vision of Jesus, Buddha, and Yogananda. These were my deepest influences. I'd studied Buddhism for 14 years. Christ had a huge impact on my life, and my wife had been raised in the teachings of Yogananda, a great Hindu sage and enlightened being. These three faces just appeared in the sky. These three faces just appeared in the sky as I gazed out over the canyon below. I knew they were visions, that my mind was creating them, but still they were significant. It was almost as if they were there to witness what was occurring, to confirm what was unfolding, as when God speaks to Jesus in the Transfiguration story, confirming, "I am pleased with you. You got it right." The source of all life. As I mentioned earlier, there are parallels and differences between Jesus and Moses in terms of how they express and relate to divine being. When Moses goes up the mountain, he meets God in the burning bush. In the Judaism of that time, God is seen as other. Moses will always be a human being. God will always be God. And the most that Moses can hope for is to have a correct, harmonious relationship with God. For Jesus, however, something very different happens. When Jesus goes up the mountain and meets the radiance of God, There's no relationship with the radiance. Jesus becomes the radiance. He himself is transfigured. The teaching contained within this story is not about relationship with God, but about identity as the divine itself. Now, I am very well aware that in Christianity, as it has come down through the centuries, the exterior emphasis is about cultivating a right relationship with God, just as Moses did. Of course, even within this tradition, that emphasizes having the correct relationship with the deity, with the vital source, or the essence, you might say. For 2,000 years, there has also been an inner esoteric tradition. In the tradition of the mystics, spirituality goes deeper than just having a relationship with God. Earlier, I shared a beautiful quote from Meister Eckhart. Quote, "The Father gives birth to his Son without ceasing, and I say more. He gives me birth, me, his Son, and the same Son." You can see in this passage that Meister Eckhart is experiencing the Christ within himself and asserting that he is the Son and that he and the Christ and God are of the same essence, the same suchness. So even in the Christian tradition, with its emphasis on the correct relationship with God, certain mystics went far beyond the notion of relationship and realized that ultimately Jesus was conveying something much deeper. Jesus' message is not so much one of having the right relationship to God as it is discovering the right identity as God. Jesus breathed new life into the old Jewish tradition, taking it somewhere that it had not fully gone before. Every spiritual tradition needs someone to come along now and then to re-inspire it, to literally breathe new life into it. Otherwise, the tendency is for religious traditions to become too insular and constrained by the agendas of the relative world. Jesus' morality is not about right relationship. Jesus' ethical center arises directly and spontaneously from divine being, from the source itself. It's not coming through an institution, and it isn't concerned with serving the relative needs and wants of human beings. This is what the Transfiguration shows, that there is a radiance that shines through all existence, and this radiance is the vitality source of all life. On 2 occasions, I have had the experience of being with people who were within weeks or even days of death. When I realized they were going to die, they actually did what the ancient perennial spiritual teaching suggests: to die before you die, so that you can truly live. In other words, to completely let go while you're alive. To completely let go is to literally relinquish the survival instinct. If you let go at the deepest level, it's very much a type of ego death. Though their bodies were ravaged by disease, both these people were radiant filled with vitality, and more alive than they'd ever been. And in both of these cases, they spent their final days comforting the people around them because they no longer needed to be comforted. They were at peace with death. They knew that death doesn't take away the immortal, divine being. For Jesus, Moses and Elijah appear in an ephemeral form as witnesses to his transfiguration. As usual, especially in the Gospel of Mark, the disciples get it wrong and suggest putting up shelters for Moses and Elijah. Now, why would you put up a tent for a vision? They're already frightened and misreading what's happening. Next, the clouds gather and the voice of God comes from above and gives its confirmation to Jesus. Of course, this terrifies the disciples even more. They didn't know what to do. Who's this guy we're following that God speaks to? What's this whole transformation about? Why is this guy glowing white with radiance? As the gospel story unfolds, Jesus discloses more and more of what he really is, and the disciples have a real problem getting it. It's as if Jesus' whole life is a kind of Zen koan, a riddle, and he only gradually displays what he is. Of course, metaphorically, the story is showing what you are as well. All these ancient metaphors embedded within the Jesus story existed well before the time of Jesus. As I've said, it doesn't matter how much of Jesus' life is historically accurate. This story is speaking about you and me, about all of us. It's speaking about a reality that lives within us, waiting to be discovered. It's your true being, your true self. Your true nature is the radiance. And in this story, the radiance and the human come together just as they do in you and in me. Jesus shows the radiance of divine being appearing as human being. During the transfiguration, it's all radiance. But as the story unfolds, we will see that Jesus has some profoundly human moments. As the transfiguration ends, Jesus says, "Don't tell anyone what you have seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." By this time, Jesus fully understands the trajectory of his life. His life is a physical manifestation of the journey of spiritual awakening. He's not writing about it. He's not teaching about it. There's not a thread of abstraction in the story of his life. He is living it. The events of his life are metaphors for spiritual transformation itself. He's living out in the flesh and blood what each human being has the potential to experience in their spirit. That's the beauty and the power of his story. If we believe that it only has to do with Jesus and not with us, if we believe that he's the only one and only God-man, then we misread the entire story. For 2,000 years, the story has in large been misread. When the early church decided in AD 325 to establish the articles of Christian faith in the Nicene Creed, I think, Jesus became the only begotten Son. Less than 300 years after the death of Jesus, the church fathers separated Jesus' reality from you and me. They said, only Jesus is the God of man. Only Jesus is a combination of divinity and humanity. The most that we can do is to have the right relationship with him. At that moment, the church itself cut humanity off from entry into our own transcendent being. It's amazing that it didn't ultimately work, that through the saints and sages and mystics of the church, that the radiance kept bursting through. People continued to discover that what Jesus realized was something they could realize too, and that Jesus was urging exactly this in spite of church dogma, saying it wasn't possible, and even more, that it was taboo. There is a passage from the Gospel of Thomas that speaks directly to the transfiguration event in this story. Jesus said, I am the light above everything. I am everything. Everything came forth from me, and everything reached me. Gospel of Thomas 77. Now, that's as clearly as the enlightened state can be put into words. I am the light of everything, the light of divine being, the light of consciousness. I am what lights up the world. I am what sees the world, and that seeing, that consciousness is actually what gives rise to the world. In some spiritual traditions, just to be the divine, eternal witness of all of life is enough. It's the goal. But in the spirituality of Jesus, that's not the goal. He doesn't say only, I am the light above everything, but I am everything. Everything came forth from me. The divine and the material realms collapse into each other, become each other. It seems as if they're reunited, but they were always one to begin with. It's just that we misunderstand and perceive division where there is none. The light above everything is that eternal still point within you that you can begin to intuitively sense at any moment. It's the part of you that has been the same for your whole life, from your earliest memory to this moment. It's what remains unchanged, the unconsciousness of your whole life. The consciousness of your whole life. Everything that light has seen and experienced has changed, but the light itself is the same light as it ever was. If you really look, you'll find that spark of intuition that something about you is unchanging in the midst of all the change. That is the light above everything. That light has not been harmed. It has not been destroyed. Birth is not the beginning of that light. and death is not the end of that light. When that light fully comprehends its own nature, then it sees that everything came forth from that light, and that it is everything. Everything, your hands, your face, the floor underfoot, the sky above, the birds, the flowers, the buildings, the cars, the pollution, the clear mountain lake. Everything came forth from that light, and it is a manifestation of that light. In the world of manifestation, sometimes the manifestation is a clear and transparent indicator of its source. Other times, manifestation gets confused in the human mind and comes out in destructive ways. But ultimately, everything comes forth from that light, and everything is that light. I call it the eternal formless form, that which in and of itself is nothing, but appears as everything. So anyone who has experienced this will see in this quote from the Gospel of Thomas a confession of their truest nature. Jesus is putting into words what the I am in all of us actually is. In an awakened being, the divine presence is concentrated and luminous. It shines. It is no longer lost and obscured by the veil of unconsciousness. Such a one is no longer primarily a person, but a presence. The personhood has been rendered transparent to the light of truth, the shining of divine being. The trajectory of your own life. For Jesus, the transfiguration was a profound experience that reoriented him toward his destiny. But each of us has a destiny. Each of our lives follows a certain trajectory, and there are moments when we see this trajectory, even if for us it's not as dramatic as Jesus's transfiguration. And often the trajectory of our life is not what we expected. So much of life comes as a surprise. So much of what occurs in our lives is not what we intended. Life never unfolds like we imagine it. At certain moments, we have the ability to stand back and look at the overall arc of our lives. We ask ourselves, what is my life really about? What am I serving? You realize that you didn't consciously create your own life or connect all the dots, though in hindsight, you may see great wisdom in the way it has unfolded. In those moments, you get a sense of underlying direction of your life. Whether it has to do with a particular role you are playing or a function that serves the greater good. This is what I think happened for Jesus. Though it isn't explicitly addressed in the text. Following the transfiguration, it seems clear that all of Jesus' actions consciously serve the unfolding of his destiny. He is going to be crucified on the cross. He is going to experience all the pain and suffering that leads to the crucifixion. He is going to go through the ascension. He knows all of this. And finally, all of him can unite behind it and say, yes, this is my destiny, and I am going to live it out consciously and willingly. Speaking truth to power. Jesus said, as I've said, a revitalizing force within the religion that he grew up in. Jesus was, as I've said, a revitalizing force within the religion that he grew up in. At this point in the story, he knows his fate. He has no reason to hold back when confronting the religious institutions that have failed in their true task of connecting people to the truth of their being. Jesus was never afraid to speak truth to power, and shortly after the Transfiguration, there's a passage that illustrates this. The scene in which he confronts the money changers at the temple. It reads, "And they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold and those who bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. And he was teaching them and saying to them, 'Is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations? But you have made it a den of robbers.' And the chief priests and the scribes heard it and were seeking a way to destroy him, for they feared him, because all the crowd was astonished at his teaching." Mark 11:15 through 18, ESV. This passage speaks to the necessity of the revitalizing force, not only in religion as a whole, but also within one's own life. Religion as a whole needs the renewing influx of true spiritual vitality from time to time. Enlightenment, real enlightenment, isn't containable. It doesn't fit nicely and simply into old, constraining structures. It's not that the revitalizing energy of spirit inherently rebels against all structures or against all authority. There are forms and structures in life that are very necessary, and there are institutions that can actually help people connect to the deeper nature of their being. The forms and structures that religious and social institutions take on aren't problematic in and of themselves. However, they have a tendency toward inertia, a tendency to simply try to sustain the institution and positions of power of those within it. When any institution starts to become preoccupied with maintaining inertia so that the people within it maintain their positions of power, then it starts to degrade. The life force begins to ebb out of the form. That's why, on occasion, it's important for someone to come along who can reinvigorate the religious institutions and bring the life force of spirit back into the old traditions. That's the part Jesus is really playing here. If he simply wanted to have nothing to do with institutions, he would just walk away and not focus on revitalization. But clearly, he is inspired to breathe new life into the religion that he grew up in. This image of Jesus entering the temple and overturning the money changers' tables strikes me as a vivid example of someone utilizing what you would call holy rage. He's had it. He's had enough of seeing the inner spirit of his religion be degraded by the institution. He's upset that the institution is being used for money and commerce, and he has become more about merchandising and maintaining power than about transmission of the Holy Spirit. When Jesus refers to the temple as a den of robbers, it's a profound critique. He's directly criticizing the Pharisees and the priests which of course get him into trouble. The Pharisees are very old ones trying to maintain their power, and they see that someone like Jesus is not containable or controllable, and so they seek a way to destroy him. This theme of those in power trying to destroy that which brings new life is a very common theme in Jesus' time, as it is in our own. Any group or institution has a tendency after a while to work more to sustain itself and the people who are in positions of power than to serve its original purpose and inspiration. This is not true only in religious institutions. We can see this in politics as well. When politicians no longer operate as noble servants of the people and instead start to serve their own ends, working to extend their own careers or rise to a higher place of power, they begin to turn away from their original calling, which is to serve the whole, to be the representative of a much larger group of people. We see the same dynamic of inertia and corruption in the power of many life's institutions. When institutions degrade in this way, it doesn't mean that there's something inherently wrong with them. They don't need to be destroyed. They need to be renewed and revitalized. And that spirit of renewal and revitalization is a real key to understanding the life of Jesus. He speaks truth to power, and by speaking truth to power, he opens up the way for a new energy to enter the institution. The energy of spirit, the energy of truth. This is one of the main functions in his life. Shortly after the scene at the temple, Jesus offers another critique of religious authority. And in his teaching, he said, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and like greetings in the marketplaces and have the best seat in the synagogues and the places of honor at feasts, who devour widows' houses, and for pretense make long prayers. They will receive the greatest condemnation." Mark 12:38 through 40, ESV. In this passage, Jesus is offering a critique of the spiritualized ego. The ego that's taken on a spiritual role and seeks fame, notoriety, and a higher status in society. Anyone who's been involved in any formal religion knows that you don't have to look far to find such people who are forming a new self-image around their spirituality. The spiritualized ego gives us a nice, positive reflection of ourselves. And I think that a lot of us, at some point in our lives, have engaged in this. Many of us get involved in spirituality and find our path, and then, without being aware of it, the ego starts to slowly co-opt that path. We begin to place more attention on appearing to be spiritual and talking about spiritual things than we do on the real heart of spirituality, which is about our connection to the transcendent mystery of existence, our own existence and the existence as such. We should never forget that this is what spirituality is essentially about. Everything else is window dressing. Jesus has a keen eye for window dressing. He can see when the ego is pretending to be spiritual, and he speaks truth to that illusion, to that power. When he's giving the criticism, when he's saying, "Beware of people like this," he might be talking to us. Am I acting this way? Has my ego co-opted my spiritual search? Have I become more interested in appearing to be spiritual or holy than in really seeking the heart of the transcendent mystery? Am I personally ready and willing to be truly transformed? This transforming power of spirit is connected to the element of fire. This is what John the Baptist saw in Jesus, and this is why he said, "He who comes after me will baptize you with the Holy Spirit and fire." Matthew 3:11 ESV. Fire burns away the old structures, the facades, and all that is illusory. It is a purifying force, a force that cuts much deeper to the bone than most people imagine. And the transformation that awakens can bring that, and the transformation that awakening can bring is much deeper than a lot of people may be prepared for. But Jesus understands the depth of this transformation, and he is ready to live out his destiny. Om Sri Sadguru Mujiji Ki Jai. Om Sri Sadguru Mataji Ki Jai. Christ Ki Jai.